Hello, this is video 10 for critical thinking, and in this video I'm covering arrow diagrams for objections, so that we can begin to use the arrow diagrams to get more representations not just of individual arguments but of dialogues. So let's just start by reviewing the arrow diagrams themselves. Arrow diagrams are an improvement or a more detailed representation of arguments than simply putting arguments in standard form, because arrow diagrams allow us to represent the relationship between premises and also to string longer arguments together so that we can see when something is playing the role of an intermediate conclusion, for instance. So these are the basic elements. Right, the most basic element is going to be a situation where statement 1 is evidence for statement 2. The other more complicated elements all involve having two premises where you attempt to represent the relationship between those two premises. And there the relationship can be conjoint, unstructured, or independent. So let's just review those last three examples. So with conjoint premises, the two premises require each other's presence in order to provide sufficient evidence to believe the conclusion. So our standard example here, all people are mortal, Socrates is a person, Socrates is mortal. Statement 1, all people are mortal, doesn't tell you anything about the conclusion, Socrates is mortal, unless you throw in a statement 2. So statements 1 and 2 are both required, and what we say is they're both required to give you sufficient evidence to meet the standard of proof in that context, and neither on its own is enough to meet the standard of proof. And in this case, they don't really do anything on their own. They're just blank. The converse case is with independent propositions. Here, either statement on its own would be enough to support the conclusion, right? Either statement 1 or statement 2 on its own meets the standard of proof to show 3. So this is a much stronger position to be in. However, most of the time, we are just dealing with unstructured arguments. So the example from the text was a principal talking up his school and saying, it's a good school, it's got dedicated teachers and modern facilities. Well, what is the relationship between these premises? We just don't know. Maybe he thinks one of them on its own is sufficient to show the conclusion, or maybe he thinks you need both of them. But he probably hasn't thought it through at all. He's just piling on reasons, right? So we call this unstructured because it's not clear how many of the premises are necessary to meet the standard of proof in this context. So again, you have the basic diagrams, then you have conjoint, unstructured, and independent premises. So the next step is to begin to diagram replies to arguments. So now we're going to be in a situation where we're actually diagramming statements made by two separate parties. Person A says one thing, person B says another. So imagine our first person is this opinion piece in a United States newspaper, right? So the person writing this article says, the United States must intervene militarily in Syria as soon as possible. The Syrian government is no longer just shooting protesters. They are bombarding one of their own cities with artillery shells. This is an older example, killing thousands indiscriminately. Military intervention is necessary to end this atrocity. So it's clear that this is an argument. I've already numbered the premises for you. We're leaving out the statement, the Syrian government is no longer just shooting protesters, because that's just setting up what the statement that I've labeled number 2, that the Syrian government is shelling one of its own cities with artillery shells. But it's clear that the description of what's going on in Syria is all meant to be evidence for the conclusion that the United States must intervene militarily. So that's in statement 1. The other thing to see about this argument is that really the two statements, the two premises 2 and 3, work together to reach the conclusion. If the Syrian government had been bombing one of its cities, and yet military intervention wouldn't be necessary to stop it, maybe diplomatic intervention would work, then you would not reach statement 2 on its own would not show the conclusion. Statement 2 requires statement 3 before you can really have an argument. And what the standard of proof here is unclear, because this is a public debate in a newspaper, and so what level of proof you need for different situations is never really spelled out. But we can just sort of assume, enough to convince the government to act. So here's the argument. Now we want to imagine someone replying to this argument. How could they attack it? How could they criticize it? What would be going on the other side? Well, I want to return to the central slogan from Chapter 2 when we discussed evaluating arguments. Whenever you encounter an argument, you want to check the reasons. Are the premises true? And then you want to check the reasoning. If the premises were true, would they support the conclusion? So you can always ask yourself these two separate questions. And it's good to keep them separate, right? One is about truth, and one is about the strength of an inference. And so, my basic rule for becoming a critical thinker is to make this a habit. All right. So when we are criticizing an argument like the one diagrammed here, these two different checks that we can make wind up playing different roles in the diagram. So we can check, if we want to check the premises to see if they're true, then we're looking at statements 2 and 3, right? If we want to check the inference to see whether it is valid, strong, or weak, we're really talking about the arrow that is going between the premises and the conclusion. All right? So now I want to introduce a new piece of notation. And by the way, this elaboration of the arrow diagrams all comes from my co-author, Cahill Woods, who developed who took what is a standard system that you'll see in any textbook and added these little details that I think make it much more subtle and able to capture what's going on in important arguments like the one in 12 Angry Men. So, new piece of notation here. The solid line means that one statement supports another, or supports whatever is being pointed at. That's what we've been using so far. Statement 1 supports statement 2. We'll use a solid line. If we use a dotted line or a dashed line, it's going to mean the opposite. We're going to start using that to attack the truth of a statement or the strength of an inference or that sort of thing. So now we've got two kinds of lines, one supporting, one criticizing. Now, we had a hypothetical newspaper article arguing that the U.S. should intervene militarily in Syria. Now imagine three separate replies to this. First letter says, there's no justification for military intervention in Syria because rumors that the Syrian government has shelled its own cities are just that, rumors. And when I wrote this example, people were still saying that, and now you see pictures of Aleppo, and it's just been bombed flat. But we don't need to worry about the example here. But you can imagine someone saying that the Syrian government isn't really shelling its own cities. Second letter says, no one can deny that the Syrian government is violating basic human rights. So they're conceding the thing that the first letter challenged, but U.S. military intervention would not be enough to stop human rights violations. Right? And then there's a third letter. It says, yes, the Syrian government is committing atrocities, and yes, the American military could stop them, but the problem is that getting involved in another war would destabilize the whole region. So now we have statements 4, 5, and 6, and we can imagine them criticizing different parts of this argument, right? So essentially, statement 4 criticizes the truth of statement 3. There's really no military intervention, there's no human rights violations going on in Syria. Statement 5 says military intervention would not be enough to stop human rights violations. Actually, there are two different ways I could diagram this. I've done this, well, here I'm just representing this as a challenge to statement 2, and we'll leave it at that. Now imagine a third letter replying to the editorial above. So this one says that the problem is that getting involved with another war would destabilize the whole region. So the third letter acknowledges the truth of claim 2 and claim 3, but gives you an independent reason to challenge claim 1, the conclusion. So we've got 3 different kinds of objections here. These are all objections to the truth of statements, and they're all pointing to different numbers in the existing argument. Okay, so these were all about challenging the truth of different premises. But let's take a second and talk about challenging the strength or validity of inferences. And actually, to do this, I'm going to go back to the 12 Angry Men example. Remember how we laid out the initial case, right? The old man heard statement 1 from, so I'm numbering the statements, not the jurors here. Statement 1, the old man heard it. The alibi was flimsy. The old woman saw it. The kid had a motive, and the kid had a record. Right? That's what you hear when they first go around the table and they all give their initial arguments. But really quickly, Henry Fonda focuses everyone's attention on these 2 arguments, the 2 witnesses. The old man heard it and the old woman saw it, because the other arguments were just circumstantial. Now, let's for a second imagine that we did it backwards. Suppose we removed the eyewitness testimonies, so we remove 2 and 3, and we just focus on, 1 and 3, and we just focus on 2, 4, and 5. Well, if someone were to present that argument on its own, just present 2, 4, and 5, someone could say, oh yes, all 3 of those premises are true, but that is not sufficient evidence to support the conclusion. This is just circumstantial evidence, and if we need to have a reasonable doubt, then if we can still have a reasonable doubt, we must acquit. And clearly, there would still be a reasonable doubt if you were just looking at these 3 pieces of evidence. Okay, so we've got 3 separate ways now that we can challenge an argument. We can challenge the truth of the premise, we can challenge the strength of the inference, or we can develop an independent challenge to the truth of the conclusion. all of these are going to be represented with dotted lines going to different locations, right? In general, though, we also have to talk about the fact that we've got two speakers, because you're going to have two speakers who both are challenging and supporting each other's statements. So we're going to imagine always that the first speaker goes down the page, the second speaker goes up the page. And as we'll see in a second, both speakers can employ dotted lines to challenge the inferences that other speakers make. Okay, so here, the initial argument from Juror 4 was that the boy's alibi didn't hold up. Now, the thing about this was that this was actually a reply to an objection, right? So we imagine that the defense had said the boy was at the movies when the murder happened. Therefore, the boy did not commit the murder. Juror 4 is putting in a reply. The boy could not remember what movies he saw or what was in them, and no one saw him go in or out of the theater, so the boy was not in the movies when the murder happened. So we would represent that like this. The argument from the prosecution, the defense, goes from 1 to 2, and then jurors, so that's going down the page. Juror 4 is presenting an argument that challenges that. And in fact, it's specifically challenging the claim in premise 1 that the boy was at the movies when the murder happened. Another place in the movie where we get arguments and replies is the business with the knife, right? So at one point, new evidence is introduced. The man was stabbed with a very unusual knife. And there'd actually have to be some supporting premises to make that really work, but we'll set that aside for now. That is challenged by Henry Fonda's bringing out this new dramatic piece of evidence. The knife was not unusual. And so that is, again, a challenge to the truth of one of the premises. That is a challenge to the truth of premise 6 in this statement. So we represent it with a dotted line pointing at 6. In any case, back in the real world, we're left with the same core case, right? The two witnesses, and it's not clear right now how many witnesses we need to convict. So your next step is to do some problems with diagramming objections. There are just a few of them, and then we're going to go on and look at the movie and the challenges to this core case.